What is up, guys? Plasma XL here, and in today's video, I am starting up the Genshin 10 minutes or less explained video. This one's actually going to be a two-parter because today we're going to be talking about artifacts and weapons, and there's a lot that goes into this, so I've decided to break it down simply into two parts. This first part is going to be sort of a general explanation of things, and in general how it works, and it's a great way to get you started. Once you understand the basics of how artifacts work, the second 10 minutes or less video is going to be a little more in-depth and explain more things you can do to sort of optimize your damage and your experience with characters, making sure that you're able to build every character because every character in the game is usable and viable to some degree. At least at this point. So as long as you know what you're doing and how to build them, you'll be able to have a great experience with any character. So with that, let's get started. Alright, so the first thing you need to know about every single character is they have weapons and they have different weapon types. You guys should probably know that by now. And there is a bunch of different weapons. They have different passives. Here's an example. Here's the one-handed swords I have, for example. And then here are the pole arms that I have, for example. Um, and there's not always like a complete like duplicate or translation from weapon type to weapon type. So sometimes weapon types can affect your options. You don't necessarily have every single weapon. I've been a light spender in the game for over a year now, and even I don't have every single 4-star weapon, let alone 5-star weapons. So it's important to sort of work with what you have and sort of develop your teams as you go, so to speak, so that way you develop them over time. I'll give you an example of this. So, Xingqiu's best in slot is the Sacrificial Sword because it lets him use his E skill twice. It generates a bunch of energy particles. I didn't always have this. I had an R1 for a while, but I didn't even have that for a while. So initially I used to run a Favonius Sword, which is a close equivalent. And I had a lot of refines on it, and so I was able to battery with him and get him a lot of his energy particles. But I'm already diving too deep into that section. Let's just talk about weapons in general. So in general, weapons, they all have base stats. You have the base attack value, which can make a really big difference. It can make or break for some character archetypes. And then they have their secondary stat, which can be crit damage, attack, phys damage, ER, um, elemental mastery, a bunch of different things. It can even be defense on a few pieces. Phys damage, already talked about that. And so these things matter when you're building characters. So let's take my Rosaria for example. So if I go to my Rosaria, I currently have her on a cryo support set. Um, and I'm running her Noblesse, so I'm not trying to do physical damage with her. One of the build options for Rosaria is building her a phys damage like you would Eula. However, I'm not running her on that type of build right now, so I decided to go with a Favonius Lance for her, and she's a character that I've used frequently. Um, Even though I have other 5-star weapon options, before I got Shenhe, I didn't even have her on my Primordial Jadewing Spear because even though it would have increased her damage, it would have increased her utility for what I use her for. So I've consistently kept the Favonius Lance on her because the energy particles she generates lets her act as a battery for the other characters on my team, like Ayaka. I usually run her with an Ayaka team, and that has allowed me to get a lot of particles. Rosaria doesn't need the particles that much herself, but it lets me sort of work on my team and have my team doing effective damage, regardless of what her damage is. That being said, there's a bunch of different weapons that also work on her. If I wanted her to do more cryo damage, I could put her on the catch. If I wanted to do physical damage, I could put her on the crescent pike. That's why I have it built. It's collecting dust now. Um, this is also a viable option. So in general, when you're picking weapons for characters, first you want to think of what that character is meant to do. So, for example, Rosaria, she is a cryo support for me right now. So I want her on a weapon that adds support to the team. This gets her burst quickly. Her burst works off field, and then her um, passive essentially allows for her to generate energy particles for everybody because I have her on a crit build. Now, for DPS characters, for example, like my Hu Tao, I'm going to want her on a weapon that increases just her damage straight up. So an example of that's like the Staff of Homa. It's busted. Primordial Jadewing Spear is busted. It's on my support Shenhei for a specific reason that I'll cover in the part 2 video. Engulfing Lightning would work okay on Hu Tao as well because it's a stat stick essentially. The term stat stick is basically used for a weapon that doesn't really have great passives, but it gives you stats that you need for your character, or just stats that are useful in general. I could put her on the catch if I was trying to do exclusively burst damage. And there was even talk when Huta first came out of putting her on the 3-star White Tassel weapon because it increases normal attack damage and you're doing a lot of normal attacks at C0. And the crit rate stat is a good stat value for that character. You could put her on the Dragon Spine damage wise, just because you're doing reactions. So having context on weapons really matters, and different weapons make sense for some characters and not for other characters. Another example is if I put um, my Ronin Shogun on the Dragon's Bane, it helps a little bit with EM. That's kind of nice, but like unless I'm doing Hydro or Pyro reactions with my Ronin Shogun, which I might not necessarily be doing that, I might be using her on a Cryo team. This passive is useless, and so for a lot of Raiden teams, probably at least half of them, this is a useless passive. She's not a phys damage character. I guess you could run this if you're running her as a main DPS, but there's some options that just aren't great. So there's some weapons that are better than others in general, but there's also some that like make sense and don't make sense. Is a really surprisingly decent weapon for her because she scales on energy recharge, but Raiden's a special exception in general. Another good example is Zhang Ling because she's the support off-field DPS, and even though she can do well with pretty much every weapon, um, you want a certain amount of energy recharge on her so she can get her burst back because her burst is like her best move, the Pyronado. And so sometimes if your artifacts are lacking, or they have like a high amount of energy recharge, you're able to sort of switch this to something else, and make it work. So sometimes depending on your artifact set, you might also want to switch your weapon. All right, next up we're gonna get into just the basics of how artifacts work. All right, the absolute basics of artifacts is pretty simple. So first off, you have 2-set bonuses and 4-set bonuses. So 2-set bonuses happen when you have at least 2 of a kind. So for example, the Emblem of Severed Fate. This is an emblem piece. This is an emblem piece. So I'm guaranteed to have the 2-set bonus. The 4-set bonus is when you have 4 of a kind on a piece. It is important to note that you do not need to have 5 of a kind. So this is a Noblesse piece. It's an odds and ends piece. It's got really good substats and the correct main stats, so I'm running it as for stats essentially, and taking advantage of the fact that you only need a 4-piece set to like get the 4-piece bonus, and using an odds and ends piece is something that a lot of people tend to forget. So it's very important to keep that in mind. The only con about it is it makes it a little bit difficult to switch up pieces sometimes, but in general, you want the best possible set for your character, and if that includes having an odds and ends piece, then why wouldn't you do it? Um, Next up, we're going to cover the main stats of every single piece. So, main stat flat HP for the flower, it is flat attack for the plume, it's always flat attack, never going to change. Always flat HP, never going to change. The sands can be either attack, it can be defense, it can be HP. I think my tome's got an HP. It can be HP, energy recharge, and it can be elemental mastery. That's the only options for the sands. Whatever your main stat is cannot be a substat, so these are all percentages, so you can still get flat values. But that's just something to note. As for goblets, they can be defense attack HP. They can also be damage bonuses, which is useful, and that's usually what's best for characters. There are some exceptions. I will talk about that in part 2. But in general, when you get damage bonus goblets, those are things you want to save, even if the main stats aren't that great, because sometimes it's hard to get good main stats. In general, with sands, I suggest you keep any piece that has crit rate and crit damage, just because it could be useful, at least at the start. For goblets, always save the damage bonus pieces in general, good for the start. And then circlets, they can be either HP defense attack, crit rate, or crit damage, and elemental mastery. I suggest saving Elemental Mastery ones. I suggest saving Elemental Mastery goblets too, because they're really hard to get. But Elemental Mastery circlets and crit rate and crit damage ones. Be less concerned about the substats and more worried about the main stats. It is most important to have the correct main stat on your character, because even if the substats are great, if you don't have the right main stat, it just doesn't make sense. Like, here's an example. Benny's an attack scaling and elemental mastery scaling character. If you're running him on all HP, it doesn't matter how cracked his substats are. He's not going to have any attack. He's not going to do damage. Um, and same thing with like Eula. She does a lot of fizz damage. If you ran elemental mastery on her, it's not going to be very helpful. And with that, that wraps up part one of Artifacts Explained. I know I went pretty quick with that, but that's pretty much all you need to know to get started and start building characters in general. After you have decent pieces and you want your characters to start doing more damage, that's when the rest of this video series in part two is going to come in handy. So stick around for that. It should be uploaded shortly after this one. Um, that being said, I hope you got something out of this video. If there's something I missed that you want me to talk about in a later video, let me know. If there's something you want me to cover, I can cover it. I've started a Discord. I've had some friends help me up to set it up and clean it up. Link for that is going to be in the description. Thank you so much for watching up until this point, and have a good one. Peace.